The diner sat alone on a dead stretch of highway, its neon sign flickering like it was running out of reasons to stay alive. Snow hammered the windows sideways, the wind howling so hard it felt personal. Inside, Grace Holloway stood behind the counter. She had wiped down 1,000 times with her late husband, foreclosure papers folded tight in her hands like a bad prayer. The lights buzzed overhead, threatening to go dark at any second, and for the first time since he died, she wondered if this was the night she finally let everything go. Grief pressed in from every corner. The storm sealed her in. Debt closed the last door. Outside, buried in the whiteout, a single biker sat on his machine, engine idling low, eyes locked on the diner. To him, it wasn't just a building. It was the last light on a road that killed careless people. Then came the knock. Not frantic. Not angry. Slow. Controlled. Certain. Grace's heart jumped into her throat as she reached for the door. Before she could open it, a deep voice cut through the storm. "If you don't open this door, someone's gonna die tonight." Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from today. Drop it in the comments. And if this story hits you, make sure you're subscribed. Rook Blackthorn did not announce himself when he stepped fully into the diner. He never did. He was the kind of man whose presence registered before his boots ever stopped moving. Tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in road-worn leather scarred by years of weather and worse decisions, he looked carved out of hard miles and unfinished business. The lines on his face were not age so much as evidence. Every scar had a reason. Every silence carried weight. On the road, Rook was known as an enforcer for the Iron Serpents Motorcycle Club, but that word never quite fit him. Enforcers were loud in other crews. They relied on reputation and volume. Rook relied on certainty. When he spoke, men listened because he never wasted words, and when he acted, there was no confusion about why. His violence, when it came, was precise and restrained, guided by a code older than the patch on his back. He did not threaten without cause. He did not bluff. And once he gave his word, it carried more weight than any contract signed in ink. His vest told its own story. Faded colors, stitched repairs. No shine, no vanity. It was a working man's armor, not a costume. The men who rode with him followed not out of fear but because standing behind Rook Blackthorn meant you usually lived to ride another day. He watched everything. Exits. Hands. Silences. Even now, inside the diner, his eyes moved constantly, cataloging the room like a battlefield disguised as a place for coffee and pie. Grace Holloway stood in sharp contrast to him, yet somehow matched him in ways that mattered. She was not loud either. Her strength lived in stubborn routines and quiet defiance. She had learned how to stand upright while carrying grief like a second spine. The diner was her entire world now, and she protected it the way other people protected family. She fed strangers even when her cupboards were thin. She smiled even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. There was bravery in that kind of consistency, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. Eli Ash Holloway lingered everywhere without being seen. His presence was in the way Grace wiped the counter twice, the way the coffee stayed fresh even when no customers were expected, the way the lights were kept on no matter how bad the storm got. He was not remembered through speeches or photographs, but through habits that refused to die with him. His belief had been simple and unyielding: keep the light on. Someone out there might need it. The Iron Serpents were not just muscle. Knuckles Kane, the road captain, carried a reputation that made other crews pause before choosing violence. Big, thick-necked, and blunt as a hammer, he was disciplined to the core. He enforced order among the Serpents with the same seriousness Rook enforced justice beyond them. St. Morales, the club's medic, moved differently. His hands were steady, his eyes soft, his voice calm even in chaos. He stitched men back together and reminded them why they still bothered to survive. Then there was Ledger Voss, who did not ride and never would. He wore clean shoes and colder smiles, representing a bank that treated desperation like opportunity. To him, the diner was not sacred ground or a legacy. It was an asset overdue for seizure. His threat was quieter than a gun and harder to escape. Paperwork, deadlines, and pressure applied with bureaucratic precision. Grace was the most vulnerable person in the room, though she would never describe herself that way. She was trapped between memory and survival, foreclosure and pride. Beyond her, stranded travelers hovered on the edges of the storm, unseen but implied, every one of them a reminder of why the diner mattered. The storm itself was a living antagonist, erasing roads, swallowing sound, and turning bad intentions into lethal opportunities. Somewhere out there, a rival crew moved under the cover of snow, using the weather to settle debts that had nothing to do with Grace and everything to do with old blood. The bank pressed from one side, the storm from another, and violence circled patiently. The diner stood at the center of it all, a forgotten place on a forgotten highway, now swallowed by snow and transformed into something more. It became sacred not because it was holy, but because it was defended. Inside those walls lived the values. The iron serpents rarely spoke out loud, respect earned through action, protection of those who could not protect themselves, and debts remembered far longer than grudges. Ruth Blackthorne stepped deeper into the diner like he'd stepped into an old memory he didn't trust. Snow clung to the shoulders of his leather-like ash from a fire that refused to die. The door swung shut behind him, and the wind tried to shove its way inside, desperate to reclaim him, but Grace held the handle and forced it closed with both hands. For a second, they just stared at each other across the threshold of warmth and cold, like two people who understood danger in different languages. Rook's eyes moved over her fast, not in the way men looked at women, but in the way fighters measured a situation. He took in the foreclosure papers still in her grip, the tremor she tried to hide, the tired stubbornness in her posture. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask if she was alone. Those questions were useless now. "You need to lock this place down," he said, voice low, controlled, like he was trying not to spook a wounded animal. "And you need to do it right now." Grace tightened her jaw. "We're open." Rook's gaze flicked toward the window where the storm swallowed everything beyond the glass. "Not for long." She didn't back up. "If you're looking for coffee, sit. If you're looking for trouble, take it back outside." That earned the first flicker of something in his expression. Not amusement, not softness, just recognition. Like he'd found steel where he expected fear. "I'm not here for coffee," he said. "And trouble's already on its way." Grace lifted her chin, refusing to let him see the crack in her confidence. "What are you talking about?" Rook reached up and peeled back his glove, checking his knuckles like he'd been hitting something harder than skin. "There's a crew running the back roads tonight. They're not lost. They're not stranded. They're hunting." Grace's stomach tightened. "Hunting what?" Rook's eyes finally settled on hers, steady as a loaded gun. "Me." The word landed like a slammed door. Outside, the wind howled harder, as if the storm approved of the truth being spoken. Grace swallowed, refusing to panic. "Why would anyone hunt you?" Rook didn't answer directly. Men like him didn't hand out stories to strangers. "Doesn't matter why. What matters is what they'll do when they find me." Grace glanced at the dim shapes of the booths, the counter, the kitchen door. Her diner, her last piece of Eli. Her last reason to keep breathing through the grief. "Then leave," she said, quick and sharp. "If you brought that to my doorstep, take it somewhere else." Rook's voice stayed flat. "If I leave, they follow. If I stay, they use this place." Grace frowned. "Use it how?" He stepped closer to the counter, the light catching the scars across his face in brief, ugly flashes. "As leverage. They don't care about you. They care about what you can be used for. A hostage. A message, a grave with a neon sign." Grace's breath hitched, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. "You don't know me." Rook nodded once. "That's why I'm warning you." His calm made it worse. People only stayed that controlled when they'd seen real violence and accepted it as normal. Grace felt her pulse pounding in her throat. She had survived cancer bills, funeral costs, lonely nights with the lights on because turning them off felt like killing Eli again. She had survived hunger and humiliation and the slow bleed of hope. But this was different. This was immediate. This was a knife pressed to the story of her life. "I'm not closing," she said, the words leaving her mouth before fear could negotiate. "This diner stays open." Rook stared at her for a long moment, and the silence between them felt heavy. "You don't understand what you're saying." Grace's voice rose, Not in volume, but in conviction. I understand exactly. My husband built this place with his hands. He used to say if you keep the light on, someone out there makes it home. People get stranded out here. Families. Truckers. Kids running from bad situations. If I close that door, I'm letting the storm decide who lives and who doesn't. Rook's jaw worked like he was grinding down a reaction. The storm's not the only thing deciding tonight. Grace stepped forward, stopping just short of him. Then you should have kept riding. Rook exhaled slow through his nose. I tried. The truth of that statement hit hard. It told her he didn't come here because it was convenient. He came because something forced him. Either the storm, the damage on his bike, or the hunters pressing close enough that he needed walls and warmth for a minute. Whatever the reason, he'd chosen her light, and now his darkness was following. Grace looked past him through the narrow window in the door. White nothingness. Endless noise. The highway was erased. Her phone had barely held signal all night. She was alone out here with a diner and a memory, and now an outlaw with enemies. Who are they? She asked, quieter. Rook hesitated like the name itself tasted like blood. A crew that thinks I owe them. Grace's fingers tightened around the foreclosure papers again, a bitter reminder that she owed everyone. And they're coming here. They're already close, Rook said. The words changed the air. Grace felt the diner shrink around her, every booth suddenly too exposed, every window a weakness. She moved behind the counter instinctively, like it offered protection. Rook tracked her movement and shook his head slightly. That counter won't stop a bullet, he said. Grace glared at him. Then why are you still standing in here? Rook's eyes flicked to the road outside, reading something only he could sense. Because you opened the door. That makes you involved. Grace's throat tightened. I didn't ask for this. No, Rook said, but you're in it. Grace turned away, anger rising because it was easier than fear. So what do you want? You want me to pack up and leave? You want me to abandon this place? Rook's voice stayed steady. I want you alive. I want you to go into the back office, lock the door, and stay there until morning. Turn the sign off. Kill the lights. Let the diner look dead. Grace spun back around. No. Rook's gaze hardened a fraction. Grace, she snapped, don't use my name like you know me. Rook paused. Fine. Then don't die like I warned you. For a moment they stood there, two stubborn souls staring each other down. Grace saw the reality behind his calm, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his side like a reflex. He wasn't threatening her. He was fighting the clock. She took a shaky breath. If they're hunting you, why warn me at all? Why not just disappear through the storm? Rook's eyes dropped briefly to the coffee machine, the empty stools, the worn floor. Because I've seen what happens when innocents get caught in the middle, and because the kind of people coming for me, they don't just kill. They make it mean something. Grace felt cold spread through her chest. She'd heard about bikers. She'd heard the stories, but she also knew stories weren't always the truth. The truth was standing in front of her, warning her, trying to keep her alive. She swallowed. Then leave. Rook's reply was immediate. No. That single word carried finality. It wasn't defiance. It was decision. Grace stared at him, confused. Why not? Rook looked her dead in the eyes. Because if I run, they'll hit someone else to get to me. They'll find a trucker, a family, some kid stuck in a ditch and make them pay for my escape. If I stand, it ends here. Grace's hands began to shake again, not from fear alone but from the weight of the choice he'd just thrown into her diner. She was not just a woman losing a business. She was the center of a coming collision. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, so faint it could have been thunder. But Rook's head lifted instantly. Another rumble followed. Then another. Grace's eyes widened. What is that? Rook's voice dropped. Engines. The storm outside was loud, but this sound had a different rhythm, a growl cutting through the wind. Multiple bikes. Moving slow, searching. Closing in, Grace's skin prickled. They're here. Rook didn't move like a man panicking. He moved like a man preparing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone that looked too rugged for normal life. His thumb hit the screen with practice speed. Grace watched him, heart hammering. "Who are you calling?" Rook held the phone to his ear, eyes never leaving the window. "My brothers." Grace's stomach dropped. "You're bringing more of this here?" Rook's voice was hard now, edged with something protective. "No, they're already coming. Once they find out I'm pinned, they'll ride through hell to get to me." The phone connected. Rook's tone shifted into clipped command. "This is Rook," he said. "I'm at the Highway Diner off the dead stretch. Storm's heavy. I got eyes on a rival crew moving in. I need hands, now." He listened, jaw tight. Outside, the engine sounds faded for a moment, like the hunters were circling wider. Grace felt her legs go weak. "You said they'd use me." Rook lowered the phone slightly, meeting her gaze. "That's why I'm not letting you out of my sight." Grace wanted to argue, to scream, to run, but the truth sat heavy. Leaving meant abandoning Eli's last dream and probably freezing in a ditch anyway. Staying meant violets might tear through her walls. Then she did the one thing that surprised even her. She turned toward the kitchen. Rook's eyes narrowed. "Where are you going?" Grace grabbed an apron, tied it like armor, and started pulling out what little food she had left. Eggs, bread, beans, whatever would cook fast. Her hands moved with purpose, like she refused to let fear dictate her next breath. Rook stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "What are you doing?" Grace didn't look up. "You're cold. You're bleeding. And if more of your men are coming, they'll be half dead too." Rook stepped closer, voice low with urgency. "This isn't the time for hospitality." Grace slammed a pan down hard enough to rattle the counter. This diner was built for people who didn't have time. People who were hungry and scared and stuck. "If I'm going to die tonight, I'm not dying cowering in an office. I'm dying with the stove on." Rook stared at her, something shifting in his expression. The first crack in the enforcer, the first glimpse of the man under the patch. Respect, sharp and unwilling, slid into his eyes. Outside, the rumble of engines returned, louder now, closer, like wolves smelling blood. Grace set plates down like she was setting terms with fate. That simple act, feeding an outlaw while danger closed in, sealed her involvement for good. And it earned Rook Blackthorn's protection in a way nothing else ever could. The first iron serpents arrived like shadows with engines, emerging from the whiteout in pairs, lights cutting narrow tunnels through the storm. Grace saw them before she heard them clearly, flickers of movement beyond the windows, shapes rolling in slow and controlled, bikes angled into the wind like the riders were forcing the world to make room. The diner's neon sign hissed and popped as if even electricity was nervous, and for a moment Grace wondered if she had hallucinated them out of fear. Then the rumble deepened, multiplied, and the diner itself seemed to vibrate with it. Rook didn't flinch. He only shifted his stance and watched the parking lot with predator calm, as if he could count his brothers by sound alone. The door opened once, then again, letting in blasts of snow and cold along with men built like the road had tried to kill them and failed. Leather creaked. Boots stomped. Patches darkened by frost and time moved through her doorway one by one. Knuckles Kane came in first, big as a boulder with a face like it had been carved out of bad decisions. He didn't look around like a customer. He scanned the room like it was a perimeter. Behind him, St. Morales pushed through the door with a medical bag strapped to his side and an expression that suggested he'd seen too much blood in too many places. More serpents followed, their eyes hard, their movements disciplined. No wasted gestures, no drunken swagger. They didn't act like men looking for trouble. They acted like men arriving to handle it. Grace felt her throat tighten. Seeing one biker was one thing. Seeing a pack was different. Packs changed rules. Rook finally turned toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You still got time to go into the back and lock the door." Grace shook her head without thinking. "And leave you all out here?" Rook's stare sharpened. "This isn't your war." Grace set down a fresh cup of coffee on the counter with hands that refused to tremble in front of them. "This is my diner." Knuckles noticed her then, eyes narrowing. "Who's she?" Rook didn't look away from Grace. "Owner," Knuckles grunted, a sound like disapproval and respect mixed together. "She needs to move." Grace straightened. "I'm not moving." Saint slid closer, voice calmer than the rest. "Ma'am, we're not saying it to scare you. We're saying it because people die when they stand too close to men like us." Grace met his gaze. "People die when they stand too far, too." That shut him up for a second. Rook watched her like he was trying to decide whether she was brave or reckless. Maybe she was both. Either way, she wasn't leaving. Outside, the wind whipped snow across the parking lot so violently it looked like smoke. The storm didn't just hide the world. It erased it. That meant anyone could be out there, close enough to touch the walls, and Grace would never know until it was too late. Rook moved to the window and wiped a patch of frost away with his glove. His eyes narrowed. "They're watching." Grace's chest tightened. "How do you know?" "Tracks," Knuckles said, stepping up beside him. He pointed with a thick finger. "Fresh." "Not ours." Grace leaned forward and saw them, faint cuts in the snow near the edge of the lot, a boot print half filled by drifting powder. Someone had been out there after the serpents arrived. Someone had moved close enough to see the diner, then backed away. A sick heat rose in Grace's stomach. "They're already here." Rook nodded once. "Yeah." The power flickered then, a quick stutter of light, enough to make the diner's neon sign outside blink like a dying heartbeat. Grace's breath caught. She'd lived through storms before, knew what that flicker meant. The lines were struggling. Saint's gaze snapped to the ceiling lights. "If the power goes, you lose heat. And you lose visibility," Rook added. Grace felt her hands curl into fists. "So what do we do?" Knuckles looked at Rook like the answer was obvious. "We move. We take it off her property." Rook didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed on the snow. The rival crew wasn't going to show themselves until they chose the moment. Hunters liked control. They liked fear. They liked making the other side guess. Grace listened to the silence outside, trying to hear through the wind. Then it happened. A crack split the night, sharp, unmistakable. A gunshot. The sound wasn't muffled by the storm. It punched straight through it. Grace flinched hard, ducking instinctively. A second shot followed, closer this time, and glass burst somewhere near the back of the building. Saint moved fast, grabbing Grace by the shoulder and pulling her down behind the counter. "Stay low!" Knuckles was already moving, drawing a weapon with practiced speed. Men spread out in the diner, positioning like they'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. One went to the kitchen door. Another crouched by the window, peering through a crack in the blinds. Rook didn't panic. He didn't shout. He only lifted a hand, and the room obeyed like he was gravity. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. "They're shooting at us." Rook's voice stayed steady. "They're testing." Another shot rang out, and something outside sparked. The neon sign flickered violently, then went dark for a second before buzzing back on. The storm swallowed the echo, but the message was clear. They weren't trying to kill yet. They were reminding everyone who held the trigger. Grace forced herself to breathe. She looked at the iron serpents around her, expecting wildness, expecting chaos. Instead, she saw focus. One rider murmured, "Backlines hit." "That's near the generator box." Saint checked Grace quickly with his eyes. "You hit?" Grace shook her head, too stunned to speak. Knuckles leaned toward Rook. "We can take this outside." "We push into the storm, meet them away from the building, keep her out of it." Grace heard him and snapped, "No." The word came out raw, angry, terrified all at once. "If you take this outside, you'll die out there. And if you leave this diner unguarded, they'll burn it down just to make a point." Knuckles stared at her like she'd just spoken in a language he didn't expect her to know. Grace swallowed and kept going, voice shaking now but refusing to break. "They're not here to win a fair fight. They're here to destroy something. And this place is all I've got left." Rook watched her for a long moment. The other serpents waited, eyes moving between them, as if this decision belonged to him alone. Rook's jaw tightened. "You got a bank room?" Grace nodded quickly. "Office." "Reinforced door. It locks." Rook leaned closer. "Go." Grace opened her mouth to argue again, but Saint cut in gently. "Ma'am, please. Let us do what we came to do." Grace hesitated. Not because she doubted them, but because leaving the counter felt like abandoning Eli's ghost. Then another gunshot cracked outside, closer still, and she realized the diner didn't need symbolism right now. It needed survival. She started toward the office, but Rook caught her wrist for half a second. Not rough, not controlling, just firm enough to anchor her attention. "You listen to me," he said quietly. "If the power dies, stay in that office. Don't come out unless I come get you." Grace's voice came out small. "Are you going to leave?" Rook's eyes held hers, dark and unwavering. "No." She searched his face like she needed proof. What she saw there wasn't bravado. It was obligation. A code locked so deep inside him it might as well have been bone. Grace nodded once, then moved. As she reached the office door, she looked back and saw the iron serpents shifting positions, turning her little diner into a fortress with nothing but instinct and brotherhood. They checked windows. They killed the overhead lights in sections to reduce silhouettes. They used booth backs as cover. They moved like men who had done this before and never forgot the cost. Another flicker of power ran through the place. The coffee machine sputtered. The lights dimmed again, then steadied. Rook stepped into the center of the diner, the calm eye in the storm inside the storm. Knuckles waited for his order. Saint hovered near the kitchen, ready to treat whatever came next. The other serpents watched the windows like wolves watching tree-lined shadows. Rook's gaze swept the diner, then locked onto the front door. He had a choice. He could pull his crew back into the storm, try to draw the rivals away from Grace's property, risk losing men to the whiteout and bullets. Or he could plant himself right here, in the one place Grace refused to abandon, and make the rival crew come through him. Rook inhaled once, slow and deliberate, like he was breathing in the weight of every consequence. Then he spoke, voice quiet but absolute. "We hold here." Knuckles' grin was grim. "No retreat." Rook's eyes didn't leave the door. No retreat. The diner fell into a tense, deadly stillness. Outside, engines circled like sharks in blizzard water. And inside, the iron serpents prepared to defend a widow's light as if it were their own. The storm began to change its tone, not easing, not softening, but shifting the way a predator shifts before it strikes. The wind still screamed, but the thickest sheets of snow stopped falling in solid walls and started coming in bursts. Visibility improved in cruel little flashes, just long enough for Grace to see headlights sliding through the whiteout and then vanishing again like ghosts circling a grave. From the office, she heard everything. Engines that never fully left, boots scraping the diner floor. Low voices clipped into short commands. The occasional hard thud of a fist against wood, like someone testing a door or a wall. Then came the sound that told her they weren't alone anymore. A chorus of engines, different from the iron serpents. Higher pitched, more aggressive. Revving for intimidation instead of necessity. Rook's voice cut through the diner. "They're stacking up," Knuckles answered from near the front windows. "They're bold tonight." "Bold don't mean smart," Saint said, but his calm voice had a tight edge now. Grace pressed her ear to the office door, trying to breathe quietly. Her heart was hammering so hard she felt it in her teeth. Outside, those rival riders moved in a widening circle, tightening the noose with every pass. The diner's parking lot became a hunting ground. The road became a trap. And the storm, which had protected Grace by hiding her, was starting to lift. That meant daylight was coming, and with daylight came witnesses. Or worse, better aim. Another shot cracked outside. This one hit closer, slamming into the side of the building with a sound like a hammer hitting metal. A second shot followed, then a third, and the diner's front window spider-webbed in a corner, the glass holding by stubborn luck alone. Rook's voice stayed even. "They want us nervous." "They want us sloppy," Knuckles muttered. "They want blood." The next sound wasn't a gunshot, it was a sharp yell, pain, sudden and real. Grace's breath caught. Saint's voice snapped. "Hold still, brother, hold still." Boots hurried across the floor. Someone cursed under their breath, not fear but fury. Grace reached for the office handle without thinking, then stopped, remembering Rook's warning. "Stay inside. Don't come out." But she couldn't stop herself from listening. Saint's voice dropped into professional calm. "Round caught your shoulder. Went through clean. You got lucky." A rough laugh, strained. Lucky ain't the word I'd use. Knuckles' voice came sharp. Who was at the window? Silence for half a beat, then someone answered. Me. I shifted wrong. Rook didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. No one gets near glass again. We're not giving them targets. Grace closed her eyes, swallowing hard. A man was bleeding out there in her diner because she had refused to close, because she had opened the door. The weight of that pressed down like the storm itself. Then she heard Rook move, slow steps that carried authority even through wood. He came to the office door. He didn't open it. He spoke through it, his voice low and controlled, like he was trying to keep her from breaking. You all right in there? Grace forced her voice steady. I'm fine. You stay put. Grace hesitated, then asked the question burning through her. Is someone hurt? A pause. One of mine. He'll live. Grace squeezed her eyes shut. This is my fault. Rook's voice sharpened slightly. No. This is theirs. Another engine revved outside, loud enough to shake the walls. It wasn't random. It was a signal. They were coordinating. They were closing ranks. Rook spoke again, quieter now, and this time there was something in his tone Grace hadn't heard before. Not fear, not weakness, but something like memory. This place, he said, it reminds me of another one. Grace held her breath. Rook didn't talk about himself. Men like him treated their past like a weapon they kept sheathed. But now, with rivals outside and blood on her diner floor, something cracked open. Years ago, Rook continued, I was a kid, not patched. Not anything, just hungry. Me and my old man, we were running. Bad situation. Bad choices behind us. We hit a roadside place like this in the middle of winter. Storm worse than tonight. Grace listened, like her life depended on it. Rook's voice stayed flat, but the words carried weight. Owner was a woman, alone. Same tired eyes, same stubborn hands. She let us in anyway, fed us. Didn't ask questions, Grace whispered. What happened? Rook's silence answered first, then he spoke. Men came looking for my father. Same kind of men circling out there now. They didn't care who got hurt. They didn't care who was innocent. Grace felt her throat tighten. Did she survive? Another pause, heavier. No. The word hit Grace like a punch. She gripped the edge of the desk inside the office, knuckles white. Rook's voice remained controlled, but something darker lived underneath it now. She died because she opened her door, because she did the right thing in a world that punishes it. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Rook continued. I promised myself if I ever got the power to stop that from happening again, I would. Grace swallowed, voice shaking. So, that's why you're here. Rook didn't deny it. That's why I'm staying. The engines outside circled again, closer. Grace could hear them now, like they were right against the walls. The storm wasn't hiding them as much. The air was thinning. The world was coming back into view. And that meant time was running out. Inside the office, Grace's phone buzzed suddenly, loud in the small room. The sound made her jump like a gunshot. She looked down and saw the caller ID. The bank. Her stomach dropped. She answered with a trembling hand. Hello? Ledger Voss's voice came through smooth and cold, like it had never met a storm it couldn't profit from. Grace Holloway. Grace tightened her grip on the phone. It's after hours. And yet, Ledger said, your situation doesn't respect office hours. Grace's mouth went dry. What do you want? Ledger's tone stayed polite, which made it worse. I'm calling as a courtesy. Our legal department is preparing immediate seizure documents. Given the circumstances, weather, access issues, we're moving up the timetable. Grace's breath caught. You can't. I have time. Ledger interrupted, voice still calm. You had time. You missed deadlines. Now we take possession. Tonight, if necessary. Grace felt the room tilt. Tonight? In this storm? Ledger's faint chuckle was like a knife. The storm doesn't stop paperwork, Ms. Torm doesn't. Holloway. And neither do we. An officer and a contractor will be dispatched as soon as it's safe to travel. If you interfere, you'll be removed. Grace's voice rose. Removed? From my own diner? It won't be yours, Ledger said. Not anymore. Grace's chest burned with helpless anger. Outside, engines threatened her life. Inside, a voice threatened her future. Different predators. Same hunger, she whispered. You're doing this because you know I'm alone. Ledger didn't deny it. He didn't need to. I suggest you cooperate. It will be easier that way. The line went dead. Grace stared at the phone like it had turned into a weapon. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw it across the room. Instead, she stood frozen, listening to the diner creak under wind pressure and the sound of motorcycles circling like vultures. She stumbled to the office window and peered out through a thin gap in the blinds. The storm was lifting, not fully, but enough to reveal shapes. Enough to reveal headlights forming a ring around the lot. Enough to reveal that the rivals weren't just passing through. They were setting up positions. They were waiting for daylight. Grace's breath fogged the glass. They're going to attack when the sun comes up, she whispered, more to herself than anyone. A voice answered from the other side of the office door. Rook. Yeah. Grace turned, fear and fury mixing in her chest. The bank just called. They're coming to seize the diner. Silence, then the sound of Rook shifting closer to the door. When? Soon as the road's clear, Grace said. They're moving it up. Rook's voice dropped into something hard. They picked a hell of a night. Grace fought tears again. I can't fight them. I can't fight anyone. Rook's reply was immediate, steady, and final. You won't. Outside, the rivals revved their engines again, this time in unison, a snarling choir meant to shake courage loose from bones. Inside, Saint cursed quietly as he tightened a bandage. Knuckles checked weapons with the calm of a man who'd accepted what morning would bring. The power flickered again, longer this time. The diner lights dimmed, then returned weaker, as if the building itself was getting tired. Grace felt the ticking clock in every sound. The storm was lifting. Daylight was coming. And when the world could finally see what was happening out here, the rivals would strike fast and brutal, because they wouldn't want witnesses. Grace put her hand against the office door, voice low. Rook, yeah? If you could leave, would you? Rook's answer came without hesitation, carrying the weight of old ghosts and a promise he refused to break. No. Outside, the engines circled tighter. Inside, the iron serpents held the line, wounded but unshaken, guarding a widow's light against everything that wanted to snuff it out. Bullets, blizzards, and men in suits who didn't care who froze in the dark. Dawn didn't arrive like a sunrise. It arrived like a verdict. The storm had spent the whole night screaming, hiding the world under white noise and white death, but morning peeled that cover back inch by inch. The wind eased just enough for shapes to sharpen. The highway reappeared in gray fragments. The parking lot became visible again, scarred with tracks and churned snow, lit by a weak, cold light that made everything look dead. Inside the diner, nobody spoke. The iron serpents held their positions like they'd become part of the building. Booths turned into barricades. Counter corners turned into cover. Every window was watched from angles that didn't offer silhouettes. Saint stayed near the wounded serpent, keeping pressure on bandages, eyes up, listening for the next change in sound. Knuckles crouched by the front entrance, jaw clenched, weapon ready, the calm of a man who'd made peace with violence long ago. Rook Blackthorn stood near the center of it all, still as stone, eyes fixed on the thin gray line of morning bleeding through the windows. He didn't look tired. He didn't look afraid. He looked like a man carrying a promise heavier than his own life. Grace stayed in the office as long as she could. She pressed her palms against the desk, listening to the silence shift. Silence was never empty. It was loaded. The moment before, something irreversible. She could feel it in her bones. The diner had become a trap, and dawn was when traps snapped shut. Then the engines came back. Not circling now, not taunting. Charging. The sound hit first, a wall of roaring motors tearing up the highway like thunder with teeth. Grace's heart jumped into her throat. Through the blinds, she saw headlights cutting straight at the diner. No caution, no subtlety. The rival crew had stopped playing. Rook's voice cut through the room like steel. Here they come, Knuckles answered, low and savage. About time. The first impact wasn't a bullet. It was a bike skidding hard into the lot, spraying snow and gravel, followed by another and another, fanning out like hunters spreading to corner prey. Riders dismounted fast, moving with purpose, weapons visible now because daylight made them careless. They wanted the iron serpents to see them. They wanted fear to do half the work. A voice boomed through the wind, rough and amused. "Rook, you in there?" Rook didn't respond. His silence was the answer. The rival leader laughed, stepping closer to the diner, boots crunching in the snow. "You always were stubborn. Thought you'd hide behind a woman's walls?" Grace flinched at the words, even from behind the office door. Rage rose in her chest. She wasn't just a wall. She wasn't just leverage. Another rival rider moved toward the side of the diner, carrying something heavy. Metal clanked. Grace's stomach dropped as she realized what it was. A chain. They were going to lock the diner in, trap everyone inside. Burn it, flood it. Make it a tomb. Rook saw it too. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time that night, something dangerous flashed behind them. Not anger, not fear, but a cold certainty that someone had just crossed the final line. He moved toward the office door and spoke once, calm but absolute. "Grace, stay in there." Grace's voice came out thin. "Rook, stay," he repeated, and it wasn't a request. Grace pressed her forehead against the wood, trembling, listening to the chaos building like a wave. The first gunshot of dawn shattered the air. Glass exploded at the front window, spraying shards across the booths. The diner's weak light flickered as if startled, then steadied. Another shot slammed into the counter, sending splinters flying. The rivals weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to overwhelm. The Iron Serpents answered. Not with wild firing. Not with panic. With discipline. Knuckles fired a controlled burst through the broken window, forcing the rival riders back. Saint dragged the wounded serpent deeper behind cover, hands steady even with gunfire cracking overhead. The serpents moved like one body, covering angles, communicating in short, sharp phrases. Left side, back window, 2 down the lot. Outside, engines revved and tires spun, riders using bikes as moving shields. Snow churned into fog. The lot became a battlefield painted in white, black, and flashes of muzzle fire. Grace squeezed her eyes shut as the diner shook, bullets hitting walls, the sound of wood splitting, glass raining down. She could smell smoke now, not from fire yet, but from gunpowder and exhaust. Then she heard it. The office door rattled. Not from someone trying to come in, from someone slamming into the hallway outside. A rival had breached the diner. Grace's breath stopped. She backed away from the door, hands raised like that could protect her. Her eyes walked on the handle as footsteps approached, heavy and fast. The handle jerked once. Then the hallway filled with a voice, low and lethal. "No, Rook." Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror at the same time. She heard a scuffle, boots, a grunt, a sharp crack like bone or wood. Then silence. Rook didn't open the office door. He stayed between her and whatever had tried to reach her. His voice came through, calm again, but closer now, like he was right outside. "They're pushing inside," he said. Grace's voice shook. "What do I do?" "You stay breathing," Rook replied. "That's your job." Another explosion of gunfire rattled the diner. The rivals were pressing hard now, trying to break the serpent's defensive rhythm. The storm's leftover fog mixed with exhaust and smoke, making everything hard to see. Rook moved back toward the front, and Grace heard him call out with authority that cut through the chaos. "Knuckles. They got a man on our right flank. He's trying to circle to the back." Knuckles' voice came back, fierce and eager. "I got him." Grace heard footsteps pounding, then the roar of an engine, starting as one of the serpents used a bike to shove forward like a battering ram of steel. The sound outside rose, engines screaming, tires spinning, men shouting. Then the rivals tried their nastiest move. A rider stepped out near the front, using a fallen bike for cover, and fired directly toward the office side of the diner. Not random fire. Intentional. Grace's breath caught. The bullets hit the wall near her like punches. Plastered dust puffed into the air. The message was clear. They knew she was here, and they wanted Rook distracted. For the first time, Grace heard panic in one of the serpent's voices. "They're targeting the back." Rook's answer was immediate. "Then they're mine." He moved without hesitation, crossing open space inside the diner where there was no cover left, where broken glass made the floor slick and dangerous. Grace could hear the change in the sound of his steps, faster, harder, committed. He was stepping into open fire. Grace slammed her hand over her mouth to stop herself from screaming. Outside, bullets tore through the diner's walls like angry insects. Wood splintered. A chair exploded into fragments. The air filled with dust and the smell of hot metal. Rook didn't duck. He didn't hesitate. He moved like a man who had already decided his life was the price. He reached the office side wall and planted himself there, body angled to shield the office door with his own. A human barrier, a living vow. He fired through a gap in the broken wall, not wild, not emotional, controlled shots that hit exactly what they needed to hit. One rival rider dropped into the snow, rolling, trying to crawl away. Another staggered back, clutching his arm, screaming into the dawn. Grace's eyes burned with tears she couldn't stop anymore. She had never seen protection like this, not the kind that was loud and proud, but the kind that was silent and willing to die without asking for applause. The rival leader's voice roared again, furious now. "You really gonna die for her, Rook?" Rook's voice cut back cold as ice. "I'm not dying for her." A pause. Then he finished, voice harder, deeper. "I'm ending you for her." The fight exploded into close quarters. The rivals, frustrated by the serpent's control, pushed into the diner in a rush, thinking numbers would win. They hit the doorway like a wave of leather and rage, and the iron serpents met them like a wall. Knuckles collided with the first rival rider, slamming him into a booth hard enough to crack wood. Fists flew. Blades flashed briefly, then were stripped away. The sound was brutal. Grunts, impacts, the wet crack of blood on tile. Engines still roared outside as bikes revved, riders circling, the whole world vibrating with violence. Rook moved through it like a storm of his own. Not reckless, not cruel. Efficient. Each motion had purpose. He disarmed. He struck. He ended threats cleanly and moved on. He didn't savor it. He didn't punish. He protected. One rival rider lunged toward the office hallway again, desperate to reach Grace. Rook caught him mid-stride and slammed him into the wall so hard, the man dropped like a broken marionette. Rook leaned down close enough for Grace to hear his words through the chaos, spoken to the rival like a final lesson. "This place stays lit." Then he turned, grabbed the rival's weapon, and hurled it across the diner floor where Saint stomped it away. Outside, the rival leader saw the fight turning, saw men down, saw his crew bleeding in the snow. He hesitated, and that hesitation cost him. Rook stepped out through the shattered doorway into the dawn, directly into the open lot, where bullets could find him from any angle. Grace saw him through the blinds, a dark figure moving through pale snow, vest flapping, shoulders squared. The rival leader raised his weapon. Rook didn't flinch. He spoke once, voice carrying across the lot like judgment. "Walk away," the rival leader sneered. "Or what?" Rook's answer wasn't a threat, it was a promise. "Or, you don't walk at all." The rival leader fired. Rook moved, taking the shot across his shoulder, instead of letting it hit something behind him. He didn't scream. He didn't fall. He stepped forward through the pain like it was just weather. Then he ended it. One clean, decisive action. No cruelty. No hesitation. A final move that stopped the rival leader and broke the spine of the attack. The remaining rivals saw it and understood. This wasn't a fight anymore. It was a losing war. Engines roared as they scrambled back to bikes, dragging wounded, leaving behind blood and the snow and the wreckage of their pride. They fled down the highway as dawn fully revealed what they had tried to do. Silence followed, thick and shaking. Inside the diner, the iron serpents stood breathing hard, battered but standing. Knuckles wiped blood from his lip and looked at the shattered room like it was still worth defending. Saint moved immediately to Rook, who staggered back inside, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping dark through leather. Grace burst from the office before anyone could stop her, running straight to him. Rook lifted a hand, not to stop her, but to steady himself. Grace stared at him, tears streaking her face, voice broken. "Why would you do that?" Rook looked down at her, eyes darker now, softer only in the smallest way. "Because I promised myself I'd never watch it happen again." Grace looked around at the broken windows, the blood, the men who had chosen to stand and bleed for her diner. She finally understood the truth no rumor had ever captured. These weren't monsters. They were guardians with scars. Knuckles stepped forward, voice rough, carrying authority that felt like a vow. "This place is neutral now." Grace blinked. "What?" Knuckles looked at the shattered diner, and then at her like she belonged to it more than anyone. "No crew touches it. No one uses it." "Not ever. This is safe ground." Saint nodded once. "Word goes out. Highway knows." Rook's voice came low, weak from blood loss but steady in meaning. "Your light stays on, and anyone who tries to kill it answers to us." Grace trembled, overwhelmed, staring at the iron serpents, men who looked like the world's worst fear, standing in her diner like a shield. And in the gray dawn, with snow stained red outside, Grace Holloway finally saw what real protection looked like. The silence, after the violence, felt heavier than the gunfire ever had. It settled over the diner like falling ash, thick and unreal, broken only by the soft hiss of engines cooling and the distant moan of wind sliding across open snow. Dawn fully claimed the sky now, pale and unforgiving, exposing everything the night had tried to hide. Blood darkened the parking lot in long streaks. Broken glass glittered like ice inside the diner. And yet, somehow, the building still stood. Grace Holloway stood in the middle of it, breathing hard, arms wrapped around herself as if she were the only thing keeping her body from shaking apart. She was alive. That truth kept repeating in her head, struggling to settle. The diner was damaged, scarred, violated, but it wasn't gone, and neither was she. Rook sat on the edge of a booth, leather jacket peeled back, Saint working carefully at his shoulder. Blood soaked through gauze and denim, but it was controlled now. Pain etched lines into Rook's face, yet there was no panic in him, no fear. Only exhaustion and something quieter beneath it, like a weight he'd been carrying for decades had finally been set down. Grace watched him without realizing she was doing it. Every time he shifted, her chest tightened. Every time Saint nodded slightly, reassuring someone nearby, she felt a little more solid in her own skin. Knuckles moved through the diner like an inspector after a storm, checking doors, windows, the perimeter outside. His presence was calm, grounding. The iron serpents spoke in low voices now, not celebrating, not boasting. They were counting heads, accounting for damage, making sure everyone who had stood the line was still breathing. Grace finally found her voice. It came out hoarse. "Is it over?" Rook looked up at her. For the first time since he'd arrived, his expression softened openly. "Yeah," he said. "It's over." The words loosened something in her chest, and she had to grip the counter to stay upright. Tears came then, quiet and unstoppable, sliding down her face without shame. She wasn't crying because of fear anymore. She was crying because she'd survived something that should have broken her completely. Outside, headlights appeared again on the highway. Grace stiffened instinctively, but Rook didn't react. Knuckles glanced out and snorted softly. "Not them," he said. "Different kind of trouble." Police cruisers rolled into view, slow and cautious, lights flashing against the snow. They arrived late, like authority always did in places this far from comfort. Officers stepped out, surveying the scene with wide eyes and careful hands resting near holsters they hoped they wouldn't need. They saw the bikes, the patches, the damage. And they hesitated. Rook didn't stand. He didn't posture. He stayed where he was, letting Saint finish his work. Knuckles stepped forward calmly, meeting the officers halfway with hands open, voice steady. Words were exchanged, firm, measured, undeniable. Witnesses were everywhere now. Tire tracks told a story that couldn't be rewritten. The rivals were gone, and the iron serpents were still standing. After a long, tense stretch, the officers nodded, took statements, and backed off. No arrests. No grand speeches. Just the unspoken understanding that whatever had happened here had already resolved itself. Not long after, Grace's phone rang again. The bank. Her stomach clenched as she answered, but this time Ledger Voss's voice wasn't smooth. It was tight, careful. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "it appears there's been a reconsideration." Grace closed her eyes. Rook watched her closely now. Ledger continued, "Given the attention this property has suddenly attracted, and certain inquiries into our recent practices, the foreclosure process will be suspended indefinitely." Grace let out a shaky breath. "You're backing off?" "Yes," Ledger said stiffly, "we are." The line went dead before she could reply. Grace lowered the phone slowly, staring at it like it had transformed into something harmless. Then she laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound that turned into a sob before she could stop it. Rook pushed himself to his feet despite Saint's protest and took a step toward her. "You're safe," he said. "This place is safe." Knuckles joined them, voice carrying weight, words already moving. "No one touches this diner. Ever. Not clubs. Not suits. Not anyone looking to make a name." Saint nodded. "Travelers'll hear about it. Riders, truckers. People who need a place where the lights stay on." Grace looked around her battered diner. The broken windows, the overturned chairs, the blood that would take days to scrub away, and for the first time she didn't see loss. She saw protection. In the weeks that followed, the diner changed without losing itself. Windows were repaired. Walls repainted. Booths reinforced. A new generator installed so storms would never steal the lights again. Riders stopped by not to intimidate, but to check in. To eat. To make sure Grace was never alone out here again. The diner became known for something more than food. It became known as safe ground. Rook stayed just long enough to heal enough to ride. The morning he left, the sky was clear and bright, the highway stretching open like possibility instead of threat. Grace stood outside as he mounted his bike, the iron serpents lined up behind him. "You ever need anything?" Rook said, voice quiet, honest. "You call." Grace nodded, tears threatening again. "You changed my life." Rook paused, then shook his head slightly. "No. You just kept the light on." He rode away not lighter because the world had forgiven him, but because he'd finally forgiven himself. The road swallowed the sound of his engine, carrying him forward instead of chasing him anymore. And behind him, on a forgotten stretch of highway, a diner stood glowing against the dark, a promise kept, a sanctuary earned, and a light that would never go out again. What Grace Holloway learned that night was not written in any rule book, and it wasn't taught in safe places. It was carved into her by fear, sacrifice, and the quiet aftermath of survival. Kindness alone is not enough. Kindness has to be defended. When it is backed by courage, it doesn't disappear into the dark. It sends a signal. That signal travels farther than anyone expects. The Iron Serpents did not show up because of money or reputation. They showed up because of a code. Brotherhood that does not abandon its own. Honor that does not ask permission. Compassion that wears scars instead of smiles. They were men shaped by violence who chose, in this moment, to stand between it and someone who did not deserve it. Redemption did not arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as action. Grace also learned how wrong the world often gets it. The men she had been warned to fear were the ones who stayed when the storm lifted and the danger became visible. They did not protect her for praise. They protected her because they remembered what happens when no one does. Appearances lie. Patches, leather, and scars tell only part of the story. Sometimes the most dangerous-looking men are the only ones willing to put their bodies in the line of fire so a light can stay on for someone else. And sometimes the road doesn't change you by where it takes you, but by who you choose to stand with when it matters most. Every road has a light somewhere on it. Sometimes it's a diner in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes it's a person who refuses to turn anyone away. And sometimes it's the unexpected people who show up to defend that light when the world tries to snuff it out. This story isn't about patches or rumors. It's about actions taken when it mattered, and the price some are willing to pay so others can make it through the night. Wherever you're watching from tonight, remember this: judge actions, not appearances. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, would you have opened that door?